guys, it's TheFrXion here, Tank12, however you call me. I don't really care. Welcome back to World of Tanks. Today we're taking a look at the M41 90GF, which is the Tier 8 German premium light tank, also known as the M41 Walker Bulldog. This used to be a Tier 7 American light tank, and now is actually a Tier 8 American light tank, but with the exception that it's a premium vehicle and that it has a 90mm gun. This is the M41 Walker Bulldog that you can play in the standard tech tree with the 76mm gun, and this vehicle used to have a 10-round auto-loading cannon, which was quite hilarious to play, but unfortunately Wargaming did decide to take it out of the game itself. So basically you now have the option to buy this vehicle for bonds. It costs you 8,000 bonds and you can get it in the bond shop. You can see right now I'm working on the Hidden Tiger, the WZ114. Probably not going to be getting it because I will not be buying it. I'll try to get it for free, but I'm on stage 3. It's day 2, but I don't really have a lot of time to to actually play on. So right now, I just want to show you guys the M41 90GF where you can get it. It'll cost you 8,000 bonds, but it's actually one of the tanks that in this collection is a lot more interesting than some others. I think the M46 Patent Korea definitely is one of the weaker ones. T-34 is one of the better ones as well. The Guard is also quite nice. The Chrysler GF is a very good one. But then you move on to the Kryslavsky, like players get the Kryslavsky, and that is a bit of a joke. And also you have the option between the Senlek and the 90GF. Both are quite interesting in their own right, but the GF is just one of those little my darlings, one of my darling light tanks in the game. I really liked this tank when it was first introduced, and I have both this one and the non-skinned version, which is just the M41 90. Let me find it real fast. This time around you can only get the GF, so you only have the GF in your garage. You'll not have the 90. I'm not really sure where it is. Oh, right there it is. This is the non-skinned version, and you can see the non-skinned version does come with the German gray. So let me just real fast take away the camouflage. This is the usual gray that you have on a vehicle. But we have the GF, which is with the Wargaming League logo, and it looks quite nice in my opinion. This league no longer exists. It was supposed to be the World of Tanks premium, not premium, excuse me, the esports league that no longer exists because it was horrible. So let's take a look at the M41 90GF. What does it set apart from the M41 Walker Bulldog? So one of the biggest change, and the only change that this vehicle really has, is that it has a 90mm gun. Instead of a 76mm gun, you have a 90mm gun on this vehicle, and it's quite nice. It used to be one of those light tanks that at Tier 8 had quite a lot of penetration, at least for like a high caliber gun for a light tank, and the pen with 182 back in the days was actually really okay. It was good for a light tank at Tier 8 before they introduced all of these super overpowered and really heavily armored vehicles. You still have the heat shells that have 250mm of penetration and the alpha of 240. So this is what really sets it off. So let's take a look at the characteristics of the vehicle. Then we're going to take a look at the equipment real fast, and then we're going to jump into a game and see how well it does perform. This tank has a 90mm gun, which gives you an average damage of 240, so damage is not going to be the highest, the alpha, but still it's decent enough. The average penetration nowadays doesn't really hold that well in the game anymore, 182mm. Now if you have to utilize the gun and you have to fire at vehicles from the side or the rear, it shouldn't be a problem, but if you have to face a WZ114 from the front because it's a Tier 9 vehicle and you'll be facing Tier 10 tanks, well, you're going to have a bit of a problem. But then you have the 250mm of penetration with the heat shell. There are some caveats and some drawbacks, but the rate of fire is definitely not one of them. You have 10.13 rounds per minute. That is without any kind of equipment for that, but with the right consumables and the right skills, the rate of fire is quite high. So your DPM is 2,430, which is quite nice, and your aim time is also quite nice as well. 1.62 seconds for a fully aimed in reticle. You have 55.7 degrees per second gun traverse speed, so that it'll turn its turret quite quickly. And one of the problem though, or one of the things that it used to be quite nice with, is the 8 degrees of gun depression, which used to be a lot of gun depression like 5 years ago, but nowadays, where a lot of the vehicles now have 10 degrees of gun depression, some even more than 10 degrees, the 8 degrees is just basically, it's average, it's okay. You only have 17 degrees of gun elevation, you're not going to have the 20 degrees, so aiming upwards is going to be a bit difficult, but I can understand that because it's a smaller tank and the gun is probably like right in here, so it's a bit difficult to aim it upwards too high. Now the dispersion at 100 meters for a light tank, I think 0.34 is not too bad, but it's still not the most accurate tank. You'll still be able to hit the tanks from a bit further away, but it's not going to be pinpoint accurate as some other medium tanks or tank destroyers. But still, I think like the gun characteristics overall are quite good. This vehicle definitely lives off by its gun, and you'll see that in the gameplay as well. It's one of those vehicles that is just really fun to use, because having a gun that is 90 millimeters in caliber is going to give you a lot more leeway and more flexibility in playing against other light tanks, and you're quite a threat because you have most of the time at tier 8 the highest caliber of a light tank. That is exactly what makes it so special. So let's take a look at the ammunition types real fast, because the shell velocity is going to be something I want to talk about before we go into any other parts of the characteristics, because you have 3 shell types. You have AP, you have heat, and you have high explosive, or the HEP shells. They're some kind of special shells, I guess. And you can see that the shell velocity is quite atrocious. 830 meters per second with the AP shell, 830 on the heat shell. So they fly the same speed, and it's really slow. Like 830 meters per second is not very, very fast. Makes it quite difficult to lead shots at longer distances. So if you're trying to hit something, you'll really need to take it into account that at 830 meters it's not going to be that great, and especially the penetration drop off at longer distances. You can see it drops off by quite a bit, by 14 millimeters penetration right there. So keep that in mind when you're playing this tank. The heat shells don't have that drop off, but yeah, they also have very limited mobility or speed. Now the high explosive shell are even worse, 773 meters per second, but what you have is 102 millimeters of penetration. Now that is something that you can still use against light tanks when you're playing this vehicle. It's awesome. Firing the high explosive shells at tank destroyers that are lightly armored and light tanks is so much fun. That's why you should always have about 12 to 13 rounds of high explosive ammunition, because if you do face someone that is out there, well, that doesn't have a lot of armor, just go ham on them with your high explosive shells. Moving on to hit points and survivability, this tank does not have any armor. 25 millimeters around the turret, 25 on the hull, and only 19 on the rear. So basically any high explosive shell that has more than 40 millimeters of penetration is going to go right through and wreck your tank. You don't have a lot of hit points, 1100, that is not a lot. So you really have to stay hidden, or you need to be fast. Now that's the next thing we want to talk about. But before we do that, let's take a look at the vehicle itself, because that's something I've noticed. Now if we do pick up some other light tanks, for example, the M41D is the same size because it's a Walker Bulldog for the Taiwanese forces. But if we take the Senlek, for example, and we compare it to the M41 GF, the one thing you'll notice is that the Senlek and the M41 Walker Bulldog are about the same size in length at least. But the M41 Walker Bulldog is quite high. It's quite a big target because the turret itself is quite elevated, because this was a light tank or a vehicle that was, well, small in stature, but still in World of Tanks there are some vehicles that are a lot smaller, like the T92 for example is a lot smaller than the M41 90GF. The LT432 you can see as well, the HWK30. The M41 90GF is just really tall. It's a big vehicle and it's a big target when somebody's shooting at you. So that kind of makes it a bit more difficult. Moving on, this tank only weighs 26 tons. It's a light one, and you can see that the engine power is 515 or 500 horsepower on this vehicle's engine. You have a top speed of 72 kilometers per hour, but because I'm using a field modification, I have kind of gone down by 2 kilometers. The one thing that I've noticed is that your specific power to weight ratio on this vehicle is 21.73 horsepower per ton. Now, for other light tanks, for example, they usually have more specific power to weight. There are other light tanks that have much better specific power to weight. Look at this M41D. It has 10 horsepower per ton more on the specific power to weight than the M41 90GF. Also, the Senlec, the T92, it's the same tank, but even the HWK30, everyone has better specific power to weight. And this is a bit of a problem that you'll notice because this tank weighs 26 tons. That's not nothing, but it's usually quite light. But because this engine is quite underpowered, your vehicle is not going to be accelerating very quickly. There are light tanks that accelerate quite faster. So that's something you need to take into account. 21.73 or 21 is not really the best. So with the field modifications, you should probably take a look into it. I have not completely gotten all of the field modifications unlocked because I usually just have the sign ticked for additional experience from our crew members. But what you should really take into consideration is maybe take a mobility category on this vehicle and get like equipment that gives you the ability to accelerate faster, and that is probably the turbocharger, because if you get the turbocharger on it, you get 7 or 10% additional engine power that in this case would be, well, about 2.17 horsepower per ton more, and that can give you a bit more of an acceleration. But you cannot get it even higher than that, I think. There is no other consumable, well, maybe to use the high octane gasoline, which will give you 10% more engine power. The thing is just that once you get to the speed, you'll be able to maintain it. It's just that the specific power to weight ratio is not very good for a light tank. That's just something you need to know. It's one of the biggest drawbacks, I think, on this tank. And one of the things that I've noticed as soon as I jump in, I noticed that it takes a long time to accelerate. Especially when you're a light tank, you want to get out of harm's way quickly. That's something that does not happen very well. So take that into consideration. The HWK30 is faster in accelerating. Everyone here is faster, basically, except for maybe the ELC even 90. No, it's actually faster, but the ELC even 90 is just smaller and weighs less, so it's not as much of a problem. But it's quite bad. Now you notice it because you're also a big target. You'll get fired, you get pumped quite quickly if they spot you and you are not running away fast enough. Now concealment-wise, it's light tank. It's going to be quite nicely concealed. It certainly doesn't have the best concealment stats, even with the right training and everything. I think the M41D, okay, that's because I have the camo net equipped, but the HWK30, I think, has better concealment, at least on a base level, and the Senlec definitely has better concealment as well, because I think this would probably be a comparison between the Senlec and the M41 90GF. Moving on to spotting, this tank has, I think, base view range of more than 400 meters. No, 400 meters. You can definitely work that out and use the right equipment with coated optics. With bond equipment, you can get it even more. I usually am running chocolate, which gives me a 10% boost on all crew skills. And that really does help me out. I'll get 486 meters base view range on this tank. And I also have the commander's vision system to allow me to better spot tanks that are behind foliage. Now, the thing is, definitely, it does work as a passive scout, but what I've noticed that it takes quite a long time to get into position because of the acceleration that you're missing. So other light tanks that are running around out there, well, they might be in a position better than yours faster. So that's something you have to keep in mind. You can definitely offset that a bit with the right equipment and with the mobility perk. And you could also just take off chocolate and you could add on the high octane gasoline, which will give you 23.88 specific power to weight ratio. And that will extend it even further. So I think that could be something you could be running as an alternative. Now, I think I'll probably try to test it out in another game, and then in the verdict, I can give you my final thoughts on what the perfect loadout would be for me, so that you guys are informed. But so far, this is the setup I'm running around. Why am I using the bounty stabilizer? The bounty stabilizer is because I had it lying around and I just was running out of credits to put on the right equipment. And the thing I noticed is I'm using the gun a lot more on this light tank. But that's something we're going to talk in the gameplay just in a second. And then we can talk about the right setup at the end of the video. Okay, so the gameplay that I've decided to pick for you guys is on the map Strudzianski, and even if I don't always win on this map, there are some really crazy games that I have constantly. There are some really great games. What I first wanted to say before we go right into the characteristics and the strengths and weaknesses of this vehicle is, did you see the EBR 90 right there? And it was a lot smaller than this tank. We've already mentioned that the size of this tank is something that you have to get used to. M41 Walker Bulldog might not be a very long tank, but it's a quite large tank. It's a tall tank. You'll notice that when you're playing the vehicle because you're going to be sticking out sometimes, and that will make it a bit more difficult because you basically don't have any armor. So how do I play this tank? This game right now is going to be, I think, a good showing of how you might be playing this vehicle. It is a decent scout with all of it, like the right equipment, everything. You're gonna have like 460 or 80 meters view range. That's going to be plenty when you're going to be sitting in a bush. But what I like to do with this tank is, just because it already has such great gun characteristics, I like to play it as a bit of a annoying little light tank that constantly is dealing damage. That's what I want to play. That's how I want to play this tank. That's why I bought it initially, because I really like the M41 Walker Bulldog, but I always wanted to have a bigger caliber light tank. That was a time before they had any light tanks in the game with calibers greater than 76 millimeters. I think 90 millimeters definitely was a vehicle with the T49, but it was a very special kind of gun where you constantly had to fire heat shells to be competitive, and it was just too expensive for me, and it didn't really work out. So with the M41 Walker Bulldog or with the M41 90GF, you have a 90mm gun that is really, really nice to have. Right there, we actually did get hit by artillery. That's something that's going to be happening to you as well, because artillery likes to shoot tanks that are lightly armored to be able to penetrate them and one-shot them. With the tracks, I thankfully did absorb the shot, and he only did 279 damage, which is still plenty, because you have to keep in mind this tank only has 1100 HP. That is definitely a very big downside. That's about on par with some tier 9 tanks, some tier 9 light tanks in stock, or the EBR 90, which overturned in this match. If you looked into the after game or the kill feed, you could see that the EBR 90 flipped his tank and he died. So that is something that happens quite often. So right here we managed to put 2 shells in the Leopard Prototype A, which is a very nice thing to do, but I thought that right now I'm not going to be very effective up here. So I decided to reposition myself because I noticed that the middle was extremely open and that the enemy team was basically controlling the middle area, and that they had like all the lights and all the right viewing angles towards our team. So they were able to spot our team and we were not really able to do anything. So I wanted to light up these guys in the middle, give a little bit of support to my guys, because we've already lost the south as it seems. We only have one more tank remaining there, and he's going to be pushed very, very quickly by several other enemy tanks. So what I'm planning to do right here is I want to sit in the middle. I want to see anything that is moving here and just, spot them for my team and have a little bit of assistance so that my team can fire at these guys from either ends, either from C6 or D6, and from J6 and K9 and 8. Because we need to get some tanks out of the game. We need to even the playing field because we've already lost 4 vehicles. but they have lost 3 tanks by this time as well. So it's really important that when you're playing a light tank, you need to know the strengths and the weaknesses of that light tank, basically any tank that you're playing. And the M41 90GF really excels at dealing damage. It is also quite fast with a top speed of 72 kilometers per hour, but one of the biggest drawbacks that this tank has is that the acceleration that you have on this vehicle is quite lacking. I did point out that the acceleration of this tank is on par, I think, of one of the slowest tier 8 light tanks with only 21.8 horsepower per ton, which means that you do not accelerate very quickly. That is something that is very different on other light tanks. For example, the HWK-30, or even the M41D, which has 31 horsepower per ton. So very big fluctuations even on the same vehicle type. That's something you need to keep in mind, because that means you will not be accelerating very quickly. Especially when you have to get out of a sticky situation, that 21 horsepower per ton is not going to be very beneficial for you. Especially with the coupled that with the size of the tank, you have a little bit of a sucky situation on your hand, because players will be able to shoot you. It'll take you some time to turn around and to run away. That's something you don't have with other light tanks. For example, the M41D, or even the other light tank that you can buy with bonds, the British, what was it called, the FV 1066, which has better acceleration but is a bit slower in terms of top speed that it can reach. It still is a very competitive tank because of the 102 millimeters of penetration with the high explosive shell. You could see right there we penetrated the HWK-30 for 295. It's always very, very nice to see those shots going into lightly armored vehicles and doing that much damage. That is why you have kind of a very, very nice tool at your disposal, because your gun is basically one of the reasons why you want to pick this tank. The gun is the reason that you want to buy the M41 90GF, because basically it's a Walker Bulldog, just with a 90mm gun, and that 90mm gun is going to be very, very nice in certain situations. I know that this gameplay right now, there's not a lot of action going on, but you can see that in the end, how valuable this gun can be shows very quickly when the game is about to end and when you have to do a lot of damage and you're in a light tank. It's always nice to have a bit of a bigger caliber. Obviously, you do not have the best pen. 182 millimeters of penetration is not going to get you very far in a tier 9 match or a tier 10 match. You do have 250 millimeters of pen with the heat shells, but one of the biggest downsides for the heat shells is definitely that the shell velocity, just as with the AP shells, is quite lacking, 830 meters, and with the high explosive shell it's only 773 meters per second. So that's something you need to keep in mind as well. But so far, I think for 8,000 bonds, since there are only I think 2 tier 8 light tanks that you can get for bonds, it's this one and the FV. This is definitely a very interesting tank, especially for light tank players that like to utilize their guns, because right there we hit the RU-251 to 368 damage right there, penetrating his side armor. That's something you cannot do with other light tanks that do not have similar calibers, or that just have like no real high explosive pen. That's something that's really, really nice, especially you have to think back when this tank first came out about 6 to 7 years ago. There weren't really any light tanks with that kind of caliber at tier 8, and yeah, that really made it a novel tank. Nowadays it's not so much, because there are other light tanks that have similar caliber, but 90 millimeters at tier 8 for a light tank, I don't really recall one tank having that. Maybe the Chinese tanks, but they do not have the high explosive pen, and I don't think that they're as flexible as the M41 90GF. So right here I'm trying to move around to assist the 1-2 line, because I can see that the SU-130 PM is kind of getting restless. He has moved up, and he definitely is going to get targeted by several tanks. I don't think he's going to survive for a very long time. And I know that this is the moment where you have to strike. When you're playing a light tank, you need to know when to act and when not to act. Especially when you're playing the M41 90GF, you lack basically any kind of armor, and what is a very nice gesture by the enemy arty is just to drive out and become a very easy target to shoot at. I kind of just, you know, take care of that artillery piece. But unfortunately, the side effect of 102 millimeters of high explosive pen is when you don't really hit a part that is very badly armored, you're not going to be able to penetrate and you're not going to do damage. But right there we spot the FV 4202 because of the proxy spot, and our Emil, no, the Yo tank actually takes care of him. And this is where this tank is going to shine, because right now we basically are controlling the southern part. Didn't take very long for us to take care of these guys, and now it's just the RU-251. We need to find that guy, and then we can basically clean up the rest that is in the town. What I am loading right here is a heat shell, because I know I'm not going to be able to penetrate these guys from afar. So I start loading a heat shell, and I know that I'm going to be able to take care of this I-6B and the TheFrXion K, because having 250 millimeters of pen is going to be absolutely a very nice thing to have when you have to take care of heavy tanks that are quite heavily armored. So right here you can see the TheFrXion K. I think I'm going to load a AP shell afterwards, because I know that hitting his rear is not going to need, or it's not going to be necessary with an AP shell, but still nice to have. So this is kind of how you play the M41 90GF, or at least how I play it. You can play it basically just as a complete passive kind of vehicle as well. That works, but I much rather get into the action as well and do some damage, because doing the damage is a lot more satisfying with a light tank than with any other tanks, because light tanks, it's not easy to be effective in a combat situation, and because of the lack of armor, you need to really be very quickly able to adapt to situations, and that's just something you need to learn when you're playing light tanks. So the M41 90GF definitely is one of those tanks that after a while, when you have learned how to play it, it becomes extremely satisfying to play, because you just have that flexibility of being able to use the gun and at the same time also being a passive scout. That's also why I like the RU-251 so much, because having the 90mm gun is quite nice. And I also like the HWK-30 because it also has a 90mm gun and it doesn't have that very unfortunate acceleration on the tank itself. So yeah, if the HWK-30 was in a bond shop, which I think it is not, I think I probably would go for the HWK-30, but right now, having this thing available in the bond shop with the the GF variant, where you don't need a skin because the skin is already on top of the tank, I think that is a great option to get. But I'd say let's jump over to the final part, where we're going to be reviewing this tank real quick, or having a little bit of a final verdict. Then we can go on and finish this video off. Okay, so let's have a final verdict on this vehicle. The M41 90GF is certainly a very nice tier 8 light tank to have. If you're grinding the German tech tree currently, and you're trying to get to the RHM Panzerwagen for whatever reason, especially since this tank is not very good, but the RU-251 certainly is. This is a very good asset. The M41 90GF is a tank that is a lot of fun, especially if you do have the focus on being a bit more of an aggressive light tank. I think there's no other real light tank that, at tier 8 has the ability to be this kind of aggressive as maybe the AMX 1390. That is tier 9, so it must be, what was it, the AMX 1375 for the French ones. Oh no, actually it's the Batchet 12T, yeah, I forgot about that. But it doesn't have that 90mm gun. So I still think this is one of the most fun light tanks to have at tier 8, especially because of that 90mm gun. Now, if you want a tank that is a lot better at being hidden and doesn't have to rely on its gun as much as maybe the 90GF, then you certainly have a very good choice with the Senlec or the FV 1066. It has much better specific power to weight ratio. It is not as fast as the M41 90GF, but it still has 65 kilometers per hour top speed, and it's a lot smaller, can hide a lot better than the M41 90GF. I think it's maybe a bit smaller, at least in height, but it's certainly like a slimmer variant. It's quite wide, but the M41 90GF is wider. But still, I think both of these are decent choices, especially if you are trying to get a light tank premium on the Bond shop. I think the M41 90GF is a really good choice. The only downside that I see with it is the mobility part, that the specific power to weight ratio is not very good. So I'd much rather have like something to actually increase that mobility. Maybe I would be taking away the bounty stabilizer or even the commander's vision. And when you get to the final field modification, which is stage 6 or tier 6, you can actually get the mobility slot equipped on the vehicle, and then you can get the turbocharger class 1 on top of it. You get like 10% additional power to weight ratio, or engine power, get 10% more engine power. And then also, if you're using the high octane gasoline, you'd get 10% additionally on top of that. So you would be looking at about 4 horsepower per ton increase on there, and quite a bit of engine power. That would be something very nice in the end, and I think that could be worth it when you're playing this tank. But other than that, having that 90mm gun, having the high explosive shells, the heat shells, and the AP shells is a real nice feature, even to this day in the year 2022. And I think most of the players will be quite happy with this tank. Now, if you absolutely do not like light tanks and you don't even care about the gun, which is quite novel on a light tank, a gun like this, then I think you probably should go for a medium tank or a heavy tank and kind of forgo the M41 90GF. But any other player that likes to play light tanks, this is definitely a good pick, good choice. A bit more of an active scale than some other vehicles out there, and I think most people will have a good time. So hopefully you guys did enjoy this review. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Until then, have a good one.